We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Aleph Amid Beis in Meseches Gitin. This is Gittin Daf 81b. On the previous summit, there was a machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Let's say you have a couple that was divorced and they stayed together at an inn. Beis Shammai say they do not require a second divorce, meaning we don't assume there was a second kedushin when they stayed together. And Beis Hillel say no, there is a requirement for another divorce. There's an assumption that they had a second kedushin when they were together. And Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says the whole machlokus is only if there were people that actually saw, if there were witnesses to the act of relations. The Beis Shammai savri adam osa bi laso bi las nus, because Beis Shammai hold that just because you saw an act of relations, but that might have been an act of relations that was nus, it wasn't necessarily a kedushin. Beis Hillel savri and Beis Hillel hold ein adam osa bi laso bi las nus. A person is not going to have his act of relations be an act of znus, and so therefore, according to Beis Hillel, we assume that it was for the sake of kedushin, and that's why a second divorce is required. But let's say there was no witnesses, nobody saw that there was an act of relations. So then everyone would agree, according to Rabbi Bar Chana from Rabbi Yochanan, everyone would agree that she does not require from him a second get. And the Gemara continues to Nan, we learned in our Mishnah, it said in the Mishnah that everybody agrees, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree, and if the divorce took place but they were only at the stage of Erisin, that for sure she does not require a second get, because he's not comfortable with her yet, and so therefore it's assumed that they did not have relations. And so that seems to imply that the case over here is nobody actually saw the act of relations. That's what the Gemara says, if you're saying that the case is that people saw that they had relations, so mali min Erisin, mali min anasun, what difference does it make if the divorce took place from the stage of Erisin or the divorce took place from the stage of Nesuin? It shouldn't make any difference. And so the Gemara says, Ella rather masnisin b'shelo ruach shenivela. Really, you're correct. Our Mishnah must be talking about a situation where no one saw that there was an act of relations. Rabbi Yochanan do'amar ki haytana detanyan. Rabbi Yochanan, when he made his statement that the entire machlokas has to do with whether it's with whether an act of relations is a bilas, is nus or not, that's going on the Tan in the following brisa. The brisa says, Amar Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Rav Shimon ben Elazar says, Lo nechliku Beis Shammai u'Beis Hillel al shelo ruach shenivela she'eina tzricha himenu get sheni. He says there was no machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in a situation where nobody saw the act of relations. There certainly she doesn't require a second get. Al ma nechliku, on what were they arguing? Al sheru'ah shenivela. They're arguing about a case where the act of relations was seen. Shebeis Shammai omrim adam osa bilaso bilasnus. Again, Beis Shammai hold that we can assume that act of relations is an act of znus. Beis Hillel omrim ein adam osa bilaso bilasnus. And Beis Hillel say the person is not going to render his act of relations an act of znus, and therefore we assume that it is a kedushin. And the Gemara continues, Umasnisa, now according to our Mishnah's version, do kimna below ruach shenivela, which we're saying the Mishnah is talking about a case where the act of relations was not seen. So b'mai pligi, so what are Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel arguing about? And the Gemara says to that, the ika edei yichud v'leka edei bi. According to the version in our Mishnah, the cases where there are edim that see them go into seclusion, but there are no edim that see the act of relations. Beis Shammai savri lo amrinan hein edei yichud v'hein edei bi. Beis Shammai say that we don't say that just because we have witnesses who see seclusion, it's the same thing as having witnesses who saw an act of relations. Essentially, Beis Shammai say, and the seclusion is not necessarily identical with an act of relations. Beis Hillel say, no, amrinan hein edei yichud v'hein edei bi. We say that those very witnesses that saw the act of seclusion, they also essentially witnessed an act of relations, and therefore, according to Beis Hillel, we assume that in such a situation there was a second kedushin. But everybody admits if the divorce took place from the stage of betrothal, from the stage of Erisin, she'ena tzricha himenu get sheni, there she certainly does not require a second get, to kevan de'ein libo gaspa, because since he's not comfortable with her, lo amrinan hein edei bia, we don't assume that the witnesses who saw the seclusion essentially saw an act of relations, because again, he's not comfortable with her, it's not as likely that they had relations. And the Gemara continues, but still, does Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Meaning, does Rabbi Yochanan really say what essentially goes like the Brisa as opposed to our Mishnah? Because it comes out, according to what we're saying, that Rabbi Yochanan issued a ruling according to the Brisa's version of the Machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and not according to our Mishnah's version. But didn't Rabbi Yochanan say halacha kastam Mishnah, that the halacha really follows a stam Mishnah? And we're saying now that our Mishnah understands that they're arguing in a situation where the act of relations was not seen, and so therefore Rabbi Yochanan should have followed the understanding in our Mishnah and not the understanding of the Brisa. And the Gemara says to that, Amoroi ninu v'aliva de Rabbi Yochanan. There's There's a machlokas amoraim within Rabbi Yochanan. It's only one shita within Rabbi Yochanan that says that Rabbi Yochanan holds Kastam Mishnah. Not all amoraim agree that Rabbi Yochanan says the halach is always like the Stam Mishnah. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Kansa beget Keireach. Let's say he marries her, and she had divorced from her previous husband with a get that is a bald get or a bare get. We'll explain that in a moment. So in such a situation, she has to separate from both of them, meaning from her first husband, from her second husband. The divorce was not considered effective. A get keireach is not kosher, and all of the penalties that we discussed above apply here as well. Get keireach. Now, if you have this get keireach, which is missing signatures, hakol mashlim, and all of anyone can fill in those blank areas and sign. It doesn't have to be a kosher witness. Divrei bananas. That's the opinion of bananas. Rabbi Akiva says, ein mashlim and olav ela krovim harauyin lohay b'makom acher. The only people who are allowed to sign the blank areas are relatives who, in theory, could testify in a different case. Meaning, even though you have a relative that really wouldn't be able to sign on the get, but these are just extra witnesses that are filling in the blank areas. That's fine over here, as long as it's someone who can testify if it was with regards to another case. Ve'ezeu get keireach, and what is a get keireach? What's a bare get? Kol sheksharav merubin me'edav. It's a situation where you have more folds than witnesses. Essentially, they had a get. A get was fashioned in a way where they would fold it over and then sign on each fold, and if each fold was not signed, that would be a problem. That was called a get keireach. You have to make sure that every part which you fold is actually signed. And Rashi explains get keireach mefarish b'seifa b'masnisin sheksharav merubin me'edav. It's going to be explained at the end of the Mishnah that the areas where it's tied, the areas where it's folded, you have more of those folds than you have witnesses. But Baba Basra Amrinan, in Baba Basra we say, the Tikkun Rabbanan get Mekusher, the reason why we even have such a thing as a tied up or folded up get, Mishum Kohanim Kapdonim Shayu Kosvin get Pisom L'Neshoseyan. Because there were cases of Kohanim who were very angry, they would write a get impulsively to their wives, and of course by a Kohen, if he divorces his wife, so he's not allowed to marry a Grusha, so that's the end of that marriage, they can't remarry. Umischartin Lacharzman, the Kohanim would then regret it. Ve'en Yecholim Lachzir, and they wouldn't be able to remarry them. And so therefore, the reason why the Rabbanan made this idea of get Mekusher was to slow down the process. V'tiknu lehem get Mekusher she'eino noach likasav mehera. So they instituted this concept of a get Mekusher. It's something that can't be written so quickly. Shema v'soch kach yispayis, because maybe while they're writing the get, the husband will be appeased and he won't divorce, he won't go through with it. V'chosben eidami bachutz. What they would do is they would sign the witnesses on the outside of the fold. The Chosev Shito Shtayim, they would write a line or two. The Karchan then fold it ala chelik on the blank area. The Tofer, and then they would stitch it up. The Eirechad Chosem ala Krach, and you'd have a witness sign on the folded area, mibachutz from the outside. The Choser v'Kosev Shnei Shita no Yoser mibifnim, and then they would write another two or so on the inside. The Karchan ala chelik, again they would fold it. The Chosem Eid Sheni ala Krach mibachutz v'chein Eid Shlishi, then a second witness, then they would fold it again, a third witness, etc. And so every single time they folded, they would have a witness sign. Now, if there was an area that was folded without a witness on it, that's called keireach. Upasul, that's a disqualified get. Kidemefarish begemar, as the Gemara will explain, mishum kulchem. The reason is because we have a gezeira. Maybe he said kulchem. Maybe he said everyone here, all of you present, need to sign. Because it makes sense to say that according to the amount of times they were going to fold it, that was the amount of witnesses that he had originally. So we have a concern. Maybe he said to them kulchem chasomu. Maybe he said all of you, everyone here should sign. And maybe one of them didn't sign, and that's why I get keireach is possible. It's missing that signature. Hakol mashlim and olav, and then the Mishnah said that according to Benanis, anyone can really sign. You have two kosher witnesses, but after that, anyone can sign to fill in the areas that are folded that are blank. V'afilu psul, and even people who are generally disqualified from signing. The only reason we're having people sign all the blank areas is just because of a mere concern. That maybe after some time goes by, if salu, people will say it's a disqualified get. People will suspect maybe the husband had more witnesses there, he didn't sign them all, so to take away that suspicion, you don't need an actual kosher witness. That's what Benana says. And then in the Mishnah goes on that Rabbi Akiva says the person at least has to be kosher in a different context. It could be a relative, but he has to be able to testify in a different case. It has to be somebody who's not disqualified from edus totally. The only disqualification is that he's a relative. But let's say the person's a thief, for example, such a person should not sign. The reason is going to be explained in the Gemara. And the Gemara says, my time of the get keireach, Kereach. What's the reason why a get Kereach is possible? And the Gemara says exactly what Rashi just said, Gezeira mishum kulchem. The reason is, it's a decree because of kulchem. Again, we're afraid maybe there were a lot of people present according to the number of folds in the get, and he told them all to sign and they didn't, and that's the reason why a get Kereach is possible. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, get Kereach hakol mashlim and all of it said by get Kereach, anyone can sign according to Benanis, and Rabbi Akiva said only relatives who could testify in other cases, but not other people who are disqualified. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, Evid my time below. And according to Rabbi Akiva, why can't an Evid sign, for example? To Asul Lameimar Kasher Le'edus, because people will think this Evid must be Kasher Le'edus. We don't want people to make such a mistake. Karov Nami Asul Lameimar Kasher Le'edus. Now, if people see a relative sign, won't they also make the same mistake and think that a relative is Kasher Le'edus? Ella, so the Gemara says, rather, Evid Hainu Taima, the deal Ma'asul Asuke Le'yuchsin. The reason why an Evid is problematic for an Evid to sign is because maybe they're going to say that he's no longer an Evid, he's now allowed to marry regular, like a regular Jew. Gazlin devar yuchsanu, but according to that, let's say the person's a thief, that's a person who's allowed to marry into the community. L'skasher, so such a person should be kosher. Why does Rabbi Akiva say that a Gazlin is not allowed to sign? Alam matanan, why does it say in the Mishnah? Rabbi Akiva says, Ein mashlim and all of ela krovim haru'iyim l'hoid b'makom acher. Says only relatives who can testify in other contexts, that's the only people who can sign. Karovin, Gazlin lo, a relative yes, and a Gazlin cannot. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella rather, Eved hainu time, the real reason why an Eved is not allowed to sign, people will come to think that he was freed when he really wasn't freed. But the Gemara says Gazlan Nami, Teshuva Avad. So by a Gazlan also, people are going to say that he did Teshuva, and so therefore that's also a problem. A Gazlan is the same problem as an Eved. And the Gemara continues, Karov, Ma'ikal Meimer, by Karov, what concern do you have? Karov, Kuliyam Mayadi de Karov, by a relative, everybody knows he's a relative, nobody's going to come to make a mistake if a relative signs this get. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Rav Zeira, Amar Rava bar Sheilta, Amar Rav Hamnuna Saba, Amar Rav Ada bar Rava. Rav Zeira says that Rava bar Sheilta says that Rav Hamnuna Saba says that Rav Ada bar Rava says get Keireach. If you have a get Keireach, Kisharav Shiva v'Edav Shisha. Let's say it has 7 folds and 6 witnesses, or Shisha v'Edav Chamisha, it has 6 folds and 5 witnesses. Chamisha v'Edav Arba, it has 5 folds and 4 witnesses. Arba v'Edav Shlosha, let's say it has 4 folds and it has 3 witnesses. Adkan Machlokas ben Nanas Rabbi Akiva. It's only in those situations where you have the Machlokas ben Nanas and Rabbi Akiva who exactly is able to fill in the blank area. What kind of witness is required to fill the blank area? Aval Kisharav Shlosha v'Edav Shnayim. But let's say it has 3 folds and you have 2 witnesses, so Divrei Hakol Ein Mashlim and all of Elakarov. Everybody agrees that in that third, in that blank spot, it has to be only a relative. You can't use some other disqualified witness. And Rashi explains Ein Mashlim and all of Shlishi Pasal Elakasher or Karov. In that third blank space, you're only allowed to use a witness who's kosher or relative. You're not allowed to use a disqualified witness. The get mekusher tzarich shlosha edim, and Rashi explains it's because a get mekusher in general requires at least 3 witnesses. Even though normal documents require 2 witnesses, a get mekusher requires 3. Kedamrinu and beparak get pashut, like we say in parak get pashut, the rabbanon tikun shema besoch kach shalo yimsa gimel edim yanuach kaiso. Because then, since it takes a little longer to find 3 witnesses, we want that his anger should subside. We want to make the process take a little bit longer. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rabbi Zeira le Rava bar Sheilta. Rabbi Zeira said to Rava bar Sheilta, Mechti, let us see. Kol shlosha b'mekusher kishnayim b'pashat dami. The 3 witnesses that sign a get mekusher are essentially the same as the 2 witnesses that sign a regular document, because 2 witnesses is the minimum amount for a regular document, and 3 witnesses is the minimum amount for a get mekusher. So mahasam karavlo, just like by a regular document with 2 witnesses, you can't use a relative. Av hachanami karavlo, so too over here by the 3 witnesses of a get mekusher, you shouldn't be able to use even a relative. It should have to be 3 kosher witnesses. Amar Lei said to him, Afla didi kashali, I had the same difficulty. I asked that question to Rav Hamnuna, Rav Hamnuna le Rav Ada bar Ahava, and Rav Hamnuna asked that question to Rav Ada bar Ahava. V'yamar Leini said to him, Hanuch l'shlosha b'mekusher, leave aside the case of 3 witnesses by the get mekusher, the lav do raisa, because that requirement is not a do raisa requirement. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa that supports this ruling as well. Get Keireach, Ksharav Shiva v'Edav Shisha. If you have a get Keireach with 7 folds and 6 witnesses, Shisha v'Edav Chamisha, 6 folds and 5 witnesses, Chamisha v'Edav Arba, 5 folds and 4 witnesses, Arba v'Edav Shlosha, 4 folds and 3 witnesses, Adkan Machlokas, Benanas v'Rabbi Akiva. That is the Machlokas Benanas and Rabbi Akiva. Hishlim Olav Evid, if you use an Evid at the last fold, Benanas Omer Havlad Kosher, Benanas says the baby is kosher, that's fine. Rabbi Akiva Omer Havlad Mamzer. Rabbi Akiva says the child is a mamzer. You're not allowed to use an eved for that witness. Avol kshar of shlosha ve'ed of shnayim. But if you have a situation of 3 folds and there are 2 witnesses, you want to know who to use at the 3rd fold. Divrei hakol ein mashlim and olav elakarov. Everybody agrees we're strict in that case, and you're only allowed to use a relative. You can't use somebody who's in general disqualified from testimony. And the Gemara continues, Rav Yosef Masni Kasher. Rav Yosef taught that in that 3rd fold, you're not even allowed to have a karov, you can't have a relative, it has to be a kosher witness. The Gemara says, Vatanya karov, but didn't we learn in the Brisa that it could even be a relative? Amar Papa says, Tani Kasher should be taught over there as well. You should say that it has to be a kosher witness, again, not a relative, according to the way Rav Yosef understands. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo huchsharu bo ela eid echad karov bilvad. We only allow one of the witnesses to be a relative. When we talk about the fact that you can sign a relative on the fold, on the extra fold, that's if there's one relative signed, it's fine. Avol trelo, but to have 2 relatives signed, that's already not good, that's a problem. Dilma asi l'kiyume betray krovim v'chad kosher, because people might get confused, and in the future they're going to say that it's going to be kosher to have such a get if you have 2 relatives and just 1 kosher witness. That's what people might come to think. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravashi says, Masnisa nami deka, that's also clear from the way it is phrased in the Brisa, that we're only allowing this on 1 fold. And Rashi explains, Lo huchsharu bo im haya keireach de v'shnei ksharim. Let's say you had a keireach and it was missing 2 folds. It was missing signatures on 2 of the folds. Ein mashlimin bo shnei krovim. You're not allowed to have 2 relatives sign. Ela echad karov ve'echad kasher. It's got to be 1 relative and 1 kasher. V'afilu hayu chasumim bo kvar gimel ksherim. Even if you already have 3 kasher witnesses, so you already have enough kasher witnesses, but still on those remaining folds, those 2 remaining folds, you're only allowed to use 1 relative. Why? Dilma asi l'kiyume hayom u'lamachrim yikra olav ira because maybe in the future, let's say there's some kind of protest to disqualify this get, v'yiviyu lebezin, and they'll bring this get to bezin, ve'ino eidim b'fanenu, and the witnesses are not in front of us, v'yavo eidim min ashuk sheyakiru sholosh min achasimos halalu, so they'll get witnesses from outside who recognize 3 of the signatures, because again, you need 3 signatures on a get mekusher, v'yakaimu b'kach, and then they're going to certify it with the recognition of the signatures, v'shemelo yakiru ala chasima shnei akrovim v'yachem min aksherim. Maybe when they recognize signatures, they just recognize 2 relative signatures, and they recognize 1 kosher signature. Ubezin and on yod and shein karovim. Bezin won't know. V'yikaimu be'edus psula, and they don't realize that these are relatives, and they're going to certify it with this disqualified testimony, and then people are going to come to think that it's okay to certify a shtar, it's okay to certify a get mekusher with 2 krovim and 1 kosher. And the Gemara continued, Masnisa nami deka, it said the Brisa also seems to say this. Hach Brisa the katani kshar of shiva ve'ed of shisha, or kshar of shisha ve'ed of chamisha v'chulu. The phrasing of the Brisa was 7 folds and 6 witnesses, 6 folds and 5 witnesses. Lo ishtamet v'tana v'chad minayu shnei karchos. You never have 2 folds that are blank. It's always 1 fold that you're filling in. Could go in kshar of chamisha ve'ed of shlosha. The Brisa doesn't have a case, for example, of 5 folds and you have 3 witnesses and you need to fill in 2 of them. Shema mina lo pligid ba da'afilu karav lo miskasher. You see that a karav would not be kosher. You wouldn't be able to have, let's say, 2 relatives sign in the 2 blanks. The entire discussion over here is when there's 1 blank area that needs to be signed. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph.